Well, welcome to episode 441 of 10-Minute Record Reviews, and this is the 10th iteration in my series, Jazz Under the Radar. Now, you may be saying, hey Alan, didn't you do one of those just a couple of weeks ago? Well, I did. I'm so snowed under at the moment with some other responsibilities, which is taking time away from my research activities that I need to do the individual reviews, that I'll be featuring 3 new episodes in this series over the next few weeks. Amazingly, it's quite popular, so I hope people like that. I will also, if I can get to it, have a video which is a bit of a left turn. Now, regular viewers will know that this series, Jazz Under the Radar, is a series where I feature great music which somehow or other has slipped out of consciousness, either because it's by a little-known artist who doesn't get much press these days, or because it's by perhaps a well-known artist, but it's a lesser-known part of that person's catalog. These aren't necessarily budget titles. Some of them you'll be able to find for a reasonable price, others probably not. Some may be very difficult to find at all, but at the very least you can stream them or find some other way to access them. One more caveat before I begin is that every now and then I slide a record into this series which really doesn't qualify as under the radar at all, but it's just a great record I feel like talking about, but those are in the small minority. So I hope this video contains some surprises and or some inspiration. Here we go, 10 more records that fly under the radar. Now, the first record I want to talk about is this record, quite a venerable record actually. It comes from 1955. This is a 1955 release by Phillips with his Quintet. It came out on Clef Records, which was Norman Grantz's label. And Phillips is a guy who really does not get talked about much today. He was, however, a reasonably big name in the 1940s and early 1950s when he was touring widely with Norman Grantz's jazz review, Jazz at the Philharmonic. Phillips had been a featured soloist with Woody Herman's orchestra, and he had recorded quite widely for Clef, which is Grantz's label, the one before he started Verve. Phillips also plays with Charlie Parker on a number of Verve sessions, and he's part of Norman Grantz's Jam Sessions recordings with Parker and other major stars around this time. This record is one which is more of an impromptu session. It features a number of musicians who were well-known recording artists with Norman Granz or appeared regularly on Jazz at the Philharmonic, or both. There's a number of impressive sidemen here, including Oscar Peterson, great Canadian piano player, on piano, Herb Ellis on guitar, the great Ray Brown on bass, who of course was Oscar Peterson's bassist for so many years, and Buddy Rich on drums. There weren't too many reissues of this record. It was reissued a couple of years later with a very misleading cover called Rock with Flip, with people doing jive dancing. It looked like a rock and roll record, which it decidedly is not. It's a jazz record, and there is no shortage of virtuosity here in the lineup. Phillips contributes a couple of original songs, one on each side, but this is basically a blowing session in which all the participants basically take the handbrake off. It has the energy of a live date. Some highlights for me are the side-by-side solo of Brown and Peterson on the first track, and Phillips' glorious Lester Young-isms on I'll Never Be the Same. With respect to Phillips himself, there aren't too many pressings of his original leader dates for Clef or other labels for that matter available. I think there's something like 20 of this one available, but that's unusual. A lot of the others is far fewer. But I do encourage you to keep your ear to the ground for Phillips recordings, whether it's his leader dates or whether it's his work with Jazz at the Philharmonic or with Woody Herman or with Charlie Parker. Now, the next record I want to talk about is this one by Herbie Mann, which was released on Atlantic in 1962. Herbie Mann, Live at the Village Gate. Herbie Mann is a singularly prolific jazz musician and one whose taste ventured at times well beyond the boundaries of certainly what narrow jazz heads would consider to be jazz. In his day, he recorded a few pretty good jazz R&B crossover records. He scored a #1 dance hit. He recorded with Duane Allman. He made some pretty good bossa nova. And he made 2 reggae records, one of which features an 18-minute version of The Temptations' My Girl, which is actually pretty good. In his career, he recorded some 90 records, many for Atlantic. His career stretches over many decades. And in that period of time, you saw his status decline from Downbeat calling him a new star to eventually AllMusic referring to him as somebody who would, quote, jump on any musical trend to make a buck. But the problem for his critics is that those kinds of accusations say more about the tiny worlds the critics live in than they do about Herbie Mann. If you rise to fame as a jazz musician, then for some people, the worst thing that you can do, the greatest sacrilege, is to make a record that people actually want to dance to. Just ask George Benson on his way to the bank. So as a consequence, you can find all kinds of Herbie Mann records that get very poor reviews, but which are still highly sought after by DJs or indeed by fans of whatever genre it was that he was performing in if it didn't happen to be straight up jazz. So as always, let your own ears be the judge. Anyway, Enough about the brittle purity tests and self-regard of the jazz critical establishment. This record is actually from a period when Herbie Mann was held in pretty high regard. It's very early in his quarter-century association with Atlantic Records. It's, I think, just the third of the 48 records he'd released for that label as a leader. It's a live date, and that gives us an early glimpse into Mann's taste for an extended groove, which would define so much of his later career. It also reflects his interest in Latin instrumentation, which would last pretty much his whole career, and there's lots of that on here. There are only 3 tracks on here, but they're all bangers. The first of them is called Comin' Home Baby. It's a cover of what was originally a fairly obscure tune. Mel Torme also covered it, and both Mann's, Mel Torme added lyrics, of course, and both Mann's and Torme's versions were hits. Then there's Summertime, the Gershwin standard, and another Gershwin number on side 2, the whole of side 2, It Ain't Necessarily So. All 3 of those tracks get an extended workout, so it's a very fun record. It also gives you a real sense of where Mann was headed. So have a look for this one. Next record I want to talk about is this one. It's by Johnny Coles. It comes out on Epic Records, which was a sub-imprint of Columbia in 1961. It's called The Warm Sound. Johnny Coles was a superb trumpeter who migrated from R&B to jazz fairly early in his career. He makes most of his bones as a sideman. He has very few records as a leader, I think maybe 4 or 5. Some of his best-known associations were with the saxophonist James Moody, the composer and arranger Gil Evans, and then later on in the 1960s with Charles Mingus. It's his debut as a leader, and it's on Epic. If you saw my label guide on Columbia Records, what you may recall from that is that Epic, as a sub-imprint of Columbia, was where Columbia kind of marooned some of the better hard bop artists they had on contract. And this is a very credible hard bop quartet. He's also got Kenny Drew on piano, Peck Morrison on bass, and Charlie Persip on drums. Amongst those sidemen, Morrison probably has the most impressive CV at this point. He'd been on a couple dozen records, pretty high-level hard bop records for Prestige and for Blue Note, and then he'd also made a bunch of records more recently for Epic, recording with a whole bunch of different leaders in the last year. Kenny Drew had moved in similarly impressive circles, and this is actually one of Kenny Drew's very last recordings, if not his last recording, before he moves off to Europe to settle in Paris and then Copenhagen, where he would stay for the rest of his career. And the music on here is really, really good, especially if you're a fan of hard bop from the classic era of the late 50s to the early 60s on Prestige and Riverside and Blue Note. In fact, I was just thinking that really, again, back to that Columbia Records piece, that Epic, pound for pound, as a sub-imprint, is a lot better than Columbia, frankly, and really is one of the more interesting little imprints to go and dig music out of around this period, late 50s, early 60s. And this one's a prime example. The originals are tough to find, but it has had plenty of Japanese reissues, which is usually a good sign of quality, incidentally, and it should be reasonably easy to find. Now, the next record I want to talk about takes us off to the West Coast, and it's made by Buddy Collette. It's made for Contemporary Records, and it's his debut for Contemporary called Man of Many Parts. Buddy Collette was a multi-instrumentalist, a very talented guy, and he was one of the very few black jazz musicians who successfully made the transition from the old Central Avenue scene to the West Coast jazz scene of the 1950s. Central Avenue had collapsed for a lot of reasons, police pressure, but also some internal reasons as well. And the scene which subsequently emerged in California was dominated by a couple of factors, heavily interwoven with the Hollywood studios, and that was where a lot of the musicians who were working on the jazz scene were making their day-to-day money. But it was also dominated increasingly by white musicians who were alumni of either the Stan Kenton Band or Woody Herman's orchestra. Against this backdrop, Buddy Collette is hugely significant in LA, not just for his musical contributions, which I'll get to in a second, but for his efforts in desegregating this whole environment. The LA jazz scene was largely segregated up until about 1953, when Buddy Collette and a number of other influential musicians like Charles Mingus managed to force through the amalgamation of the 2 different musicians' unions, the white one and the black one, to form one union. Unfortunately, this was a little bit too late to benefit some of the leading lights of the Central Avenue jazz scene, people like Dexter Gordon and Wardell Gray and Teddy Edwards, who, for a variety of reasons, by the mid-1950s had disappeared from the LA scene, some through misadventure, some because they just had enough. So it's all the more remarkable that people like Collette and his peers like Leroy Vinnegar and Curtis Counts managed to forge the careers they did in the following decade. And one of the key places that provided them with that opportunity was Les Koenig's Contemporary Records. Koenig himself had been blacklisted by McCarthy's Un-American Activities Committee previously, forcing him out of Hollywood and into the music industry. So Contemporary, which was the label he founded, became a natural home for people who were not going to get signed by Capitol or by ABC Paramount, who were unlikely to sign lesser-known black artists. Collette had been in Chico Hamilton's groundbreaking Quintet prior to this, and he'd been on a Blue Note compilation of West Coast musicians, but this is his first record as a leader. It's a mixture of octet, quintet, and quartet recordings, all of which showcase Collette's skills as a composer. He writes, I think, 9 of the tracks on here. And it's quintessential contemporary. It's lighthearted, it's seriously swinging, it's beautifully recorded, and the musicianship is excellent. A few of the reasons why, pound for pound, it's probably my favorite jazz label. Anyway, I can't imagine any fan of jazz not liking this jazz record. If you don't know of Buddy Collette, this is a wonderful place to dive in, and he's got a fantastic catalog once you're hooked. The next record I want to talk about is this one, which is a reissue on VSOP of that lovely little run of records on the short-lived label Mode that came out in 1957. It's by Pepper Adams. It's called the Pepper Adams Quintet, and it has one of those very nice portraits on the front cover done by the artist Ava Diana. Pepper Adams was a baritone saxophonist from Detroit whom Stan Kenton had brought into his band on a recommendation from Oscar Pettiford, who had seen Adams playing on the club scene in the Motor City. That was in 1956, and he toured with Kenton that year. The following year, in 1957, he settles down in LA, first of all playing with the drummer Mel Lewis and then with Maynard Ferguson. After that, he begins to play with Chet Baker, and it's around the time that he was with Baker that he makes this record for Mode in the summer, I think, of 1957. There are some serious hardcore swingers on this record, which as far as I can tell was pulled together as a one-off recording date. Stu Williamson, who's Claude's brother, wonderful trumpet player, Carl Perkins, the diamond that he was on piano, just such a swinging piano player, one of the best hard bop piano players there was. Leroy Vinegar on bass, rock solid, and again, the drummer Mel Lewis. And this is yet another of those records which puts the lie to the idea that West Coast jazz of this era was some kind of weak tea compared to its East Coast equivalent. And one of the biggest reasons for that is Adams himself, who plays his baritone like he's unaware that the thing to do with a big instrument is to play it slowly. Led by his virtuosity, this record really cooks. So I guess what I'm trying to say is find this if you can. There are some very credible reissues. The VSOP reissue series in the 1980s, 1985 I think it was, are pretty good. But what this little label needs is only about 3 dozen records. This label needs a whole dedicated reissue series. That would be a great boon to the jazz listening world. Now, another record by a baritone saxophonist, albeit one with a slightly sadder personal history, Serge Chaloff. This is his record called Boston Blow Up, and it came out on Capitol in 1955. This is one of those records, and you can see this here, it says Kenton Presents Jazz. One of those records that's within this Kenton Presents Jazz series on Capitol, in which Stan Kenton, who was a well-known band leader at the time, would present different members of his own orchestra who were stepping out to make their own small combo records. The oddity about this one is that Chaloff never actually played with Stan Kenton. He was recommended to Capitol, I think this is the connection, by Boots Masouli, who was a Kenton musician, who also appears in this record. Capitol was pretty freaked out about the whole idea because Chaloff at the time had a pretty sketchy reputation as somebody who had serious addiction issues and was very unreliable. He was a heroin addict and also a fairly committed alcoholic. The past few years had seen him give up playing jazz entirely in 1952. He then has a comeback in 1953 in Boston, which is pretty chaotic and is characterized by all manner of onstage incidents and no-shows. That whole phase wound down when in 1954, broke and strung out, he enters rehab, and he'd only just emerged from hospital, clean for the very first time 2 months before he steps into the studio to make this record. And this record, despite being recorded in New York, is actually called Boston Blow Up for a good reason, because a good number of the musicians on here, including Boots Masouli and including Herb Pomeroy, the trumpeter, as well as, of course, Chaloff himself, were from Boston. It's a terrific recording. Chaloff, like Adams, was capable of taking a vigorous, virtuosic approach to the baritone, and we get a full demonstration of his range of talent. Chaloff is in great form. It helps to be sober, and he also had written half of the tracks on here, original compositions. Herb Pomeroy, the trumpeter, who is a guy who basically remains on the margins of the broader jazz world because he elects to stay in Boston for his whole career, is also excellent on this record. This record is a dawning of the final flourish of Chaloff's career, which also includes a great record he made out in LA, of which you may have heard, Blue Serge, and a collaborative record he made with Zoot Sims and Cohn. But he's then diagnosed with spinal cancer, and he's gone by July 1957. So it's a terrible shame. He's a wonderful talent. He was bogged down by addictions. He finally gets clean. He makes the greatest music of his career, but then he's swept away just as he's hitting the high points. But at least we can be grateful that he did have that final flourish and make the music that he did. Now, the next one is a record by John LaPorta and his quartet, The Most Minor. It comes out on Everest Records in 1959. And I will confess that I bought this record not knowing who John LaPorta was, but only really based on two criteria. Well, three. A, it was only $10. B, it was a quartet record from the late 50s, and I thought, well, how bad can that be? And third, I love the cover art. And to my great pleasure, that $10 turned out to be money well spent and then some. John LaPorta was a multi-instrumentalist reed player. The fact that I hadn't heard of him at the time I bought this record says more about me than it says about him. He had a truly lovely tone as an altoist. He also played clarinet, and he spent a couple years previously with the Woody Herman Band. In his career, he was both a performer and a music educator. He had what you might call third stream sensibilities. He'd spent some time with Charles Mingus's Jazz Composers Workshop, and he also taught at the Berklee College of Music. I should add, though, for anybody getting worried about this kind of thing, that this is not a third stream record. This is straight up bop. He's supported by the drummer Charlie Perry, who also played with Stan Getz, with Kai Winding, with George Wallington, and with Mal Waldron. And there are two lesser-known musicians on here as well, the piano player Jack Riley and Dick Carter on bass. There are plenty of highlights, including a number of original tracks, surprisingly enough. In fact, I think at least 6, and so the majority of the tracks on here are written by quartet members themselves. And of those, I have to say, I really enjoyed both Searching and Buzzin'. Anyway, look for this one. It will not be that hard to find or that expensive to pick up. It's a record I could have featured in one of those jazz bargain videos instead. As I say, easy to find and quite inexpensive. Okay, the next record is made by that little-known artist, Charles Mingus. Okay, not little known, but this is one of his records which doesn't get that much attention. It's made in a sextet format, and it occurs in a little window where he makes 2 records for Bethlehem, a small label, in between some great records that he made for Atlantic, like Pithecanthropus erectus, and then his fantastic work he did with Columbia. The personnel on here are longtime collaborators with Mingus and or members of his jazz workshop from the mid-1950s, so it's not too surprising to see names like the trombonist Jimmy Knepper, Shafi Hadi, the saxophonist, and Clarence Shaw on trumpet, Danny Richmond on drums as well. The name which really stands out here, however, is Bill Evans on piano. Bill Evans, and I did not know this actually until I was just doing a bit of research about this, was actually in Charles Mingus's jazz workshop very briefly in the summer of '57. And as far as I know, it's the only time when either Evans or Mingus appeared on a record of which the other was the leader. 2 enormous personalities of jazz, 2 people who I would say in their own way suffered with mental illness throughout their careers, manifesting itself differently, of course. Evans, a delicate, hero-independent, semi-recluse, a classical music fan, channeling beautiful music while seeming withdrawn to the point of weirdness in concert. Mingus, the boisterous kicker down of walls, either charismatic or abusive, depending on the day. It doesn't seem like it would work, but it kind of does here, even if there are some kind of semi-comical moments, like on the track West Coast Ghost, when an Evans solo takes what is, up until that point, a typical Mingus composition into sounding something like a dry run for Kind of Blue. On this record, Mingus is the one who's the established genius, who's a jazz superstar. Evans is relatively unknown, but you can tell that like all great players, he can't help but be himself, and that's why the contrast is so interesting. Mingus is his usual self. The compositions are characteristically him, perhaps not as well elaborated as on records to come in the later 50s and the 1960s. But even at this point, it's the composition and arrangement, I would say, even more than his bass playing, which is his calling card. I think I called the Buddy Collette record lighthearted earlier. Mingus is definitely not that. He's often witty, but there's a seriousness and a heaviness about his approach. In fact, I rather like this phase of Mingus's career. I sometimes feel that when he goes full Mingus, as he does in the 1960s, it leads to really interesting records which, however, don't swing as hard as they could, and this one definitely swings. Anyway, this one might be hard to find, but even if you have to stream it first, which I guess I would recommend anyway if you're looking for the vinyl, I encourage you to listen to this. It's super interesting. It's a very listenable record. Now, this record, nice and shiny, eh? I think this is the first pressing, is one of those live records that really places you sonically right in the room. It's one of a fairly extensive list of collaborations between the tenor players Zoot Sims and Al Cohn, which work very well, I think, because of the differences in character between the playing of the 2 main musicians. It's made at the Half Note, one of New York City's long-lost classic jazz clubs, and Sims and Cohn are joined by an interesting lineup. Filling out the quintet are Nobby Toda, the bassist originally from Ramallah, Paul Motion, the future giant of post-bop jazz drumming, and Mose Allison, the erstwhile soul jazz crooner on Prestige Records, on piano. As well, a 3rd saxophonist joins the proceedings on side 2, Phil Woods, who brings his alto to join the 2 tenors. With two tenors and an alto, it's always kind of fun on a record like this to try and pick out the order of the solos. It's pretty challenging, I will say, on this one. Ira Gitler claims to have done so in the liner notes, but then if you can see here is a picture of him drinking beer as he's listening, so I don't know entirely how reliable that is, and actually I think he goofs on a couple of occasions. The first side of this record is very good, but I have to say the whole level of quality goes up a notch in the second side when Woods comes in, mainly because of the different colors that his alto is able to paint. The music is straight ahead jazz. I guess you'd call it hard bop. The production, given that it's a live date, as I mentioned, is excellent. And if you like this one, I would feel very comfortable recommending pretty much any of the Sims-Cohn collaborations. I think there's something like 10 of them in total. The last record I want to talk about is a record which comes out a little bit later than some of these others. It's by Charlie Haden, the bass player. It's called The Golden Number. It comes out in Horizon Records, which, if I remember correctly, is an A&M sub-imprint. It's one of two records which Haden records in the mid-1970s with a bunch of other invited guest musicians, largely long-standing collaborators and friends of his, to make a series of duets. I actually reviewed the first of those records, Closeness, a few years ago on the channel, in I think 2022, and both of these records were produced by Ed Michel, who previously had been at the helm at Impulse Records in the late 60s and early 70s during their classic spiritual jazz years. The first record had included some remarkable musicians in duet with Haden, including Alice Coltrane, Keith Jarrett, Ornette Coleman, and Paul Motian. And this record continues in the same vein. The featured partners of Haden here are Don Cherry, he of the Cornet, and the collaborations with Ornette Coleman in the early 60s, which set the world on its ear free jazz-wise, and Coleman himself is here, although he's actually playing the trumpet. The wonderful piano player Hampton Hawes, probably, well, at least by some distance actually, the most straight-ahead jazz player on here, and Archie Shepp, the avant-garde saxophonist and acolyte of John Coltrane. Both these records are excellent. They were made when Haden was in a more settled space. He had struggled quite a lot with heroin addiction at various points in the 60s and I think the early 70s as well. Don't quite have the chronology fresh in my head. And that had damaged his musical career, obviously damaged some of his relationships as well. I don't know if his sobriety conditions the music or if he's mending a few fences with some of these duets, but in any event, what comes through is a really, just a beautiful sense of peace through all these duets. It's what you might call mellow avant-garde. I guess that's how I'd characterize this. And the pick of the four tracks, I think, is almost certainly the one with Hawes, with the differences in their styles adding just a lot of zest to it. It's also kind of bittersweet because Hawes dies not long after that track is recorded. It's one of his very last recordings, actually, and Haden dedicates this record to Hawes. The only caveat I would add is, mellow or not, I wouldn't pick this record up unless you are at least free jazz curious, because some of the music on here is quite discordant. It's all very good, but this is not a record full of straight ahead jazz. But if you are that way inclined, this record and its predecessor are what I would call essential. So there we have it. 10 records that fly under the radar. I hope that you enjoyed those recommendations. I'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback and your suggestions about other records. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.